The conquest of the Achaemenid Empire by the Greek forces of Alexander III of Macedon is rightly seen as one of the most pivotal events in world history. At the head of a highly innovative and efficient military machine, the young Macedonian general managed to bring down the largest superpower the earth had yet seen up to that point. Many scholars have sought to answer why Alexander succeeded in this feat. Sometimes, the role is credited to Alexander's strategic brilliance or to the supposed incompetence of his Persian rival, Darius III. The truth, as with any large-scale military undertaking, rests on a combination of factors, from the legacy left to Alexander by his father Philip, to the inherent structural weaknesses of the Persian Empire, and to Alexander's own extraordinary capacity for military and political improvisation. Background factors. The first element that contributed to the Alexandrian onslaught across Iran has very little to do with either Alexander or his adversary, Darius III. This factor is simply the background of the states and societies in which both rulers grew up before their epic clashes at Issus and Gaugamela. Alexander, though undoubtedly a military mastermind, could not have realized his ambitions without the legacy of his father, Philip II of Macedon. Philip was both a seminal military reformer and a shrewd diplomat. Points we have covered in our earlier videos and in our members-only series on the Grand Statesman. When Philip rose to power, Macedon faced threats from the Illyrian kingdoms to the north and was, at best, a secondary power in Hellas. His military reforms, including innovations like sappers and siege engines, as well as the formalization of the long spear known as the sarissa, turned the kingdom into a Greek powerhouse. He also managed to either annex or subjugate all of Greece through military campaigns and the League of Corinth. His entire military career in the latter half of the 4th century BCE was dedicated to this effort. Furthermore, Philip had his own plans for attacking Persia and had already sent preliminary contingents to Asia Minor, which Alexander could later use when he began his operations. So Alexander inherited from his father a strong military force, one with experience and strategic cohesion. Moreover, the Greek allies of the Macedonians provided him with both security on his southern flank in Hellas and additional military personnel, all of which contributed to his success in Persia. Turning our eyes eastward, we find that Darius III faced a more difficult situation to manage, because the Achaemenid Persian Empire was less stable than it had been under Darius I and Xerxes in the 5th century BCE. Our sources on 4th century Persia are scarce and often exclusively Greek in nature, carrying the usual anti-Persian biases that implies. Still, some information reveals the fragmented state of Persia at that time. Before Darius, the previous Shahanshah was Arses, who appears to have reigned for only 2 years, 338–336. He was allegedly under the control of a eunuch named Bagos, though this might be a fanciful Greek tale meant to denigrate the Achaemenids. Before him, Artaxerxes III ruled for about 20 years but had to contend with various revolts, including one in Egypt, which had been independent from Persia for nearly 6 decades. His own father, Artaxerxes II, also had to fight his brother Cyrus for control of the throne. The same conflict in which the Athenian soldier and writer Xenophon served, later recording his experiences in the Anabasis. Thus, by the time Darius came to power, the political environment was rather unstable. The young Shahanshah is often unfairly depicted in the sources as a coward or a weakling, but the truth is that he faced a much harder context once he assumed the throne. Political success is often as much about circumstances as about skill, and in Darius's case, he inherited a far less robust empire than Alexander did. The Greek general had a strong foundation to build upon, and he used it to his utmost advantage, whereas Darius had to make do with what he had. Military factors. Beyond the background factors that gave Alexander an edge, there was also the most fundamental aspect: military innovation. Here, the importance of Alexander's abilities as a commander and tactician came to the fore on more than one occasion. The Greek army that marched into Asia Minor in 334 BCE was a flexible, well-trained military machine. Within its ranks were Greek troops, serving as both hoplites and peltasts, as well as experienced mercenaries from the Balkans. The Macedonians, especially the companions who served alongside Alexander, came from aristocratic families that had risen through the ranks based on talent, enabling them to devise masterful military strategies. Other innovative specialist units, such as the hypaspists with their light infantry capabilities, also gave the young king flexibility on the battlefield. Additionally, Alexander's pesatiroi were defined by their use of the sarissa, an innovation that allowed for greater control over how battles unfolded, thanks to the power of distance. This is most evident at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, where Alexander's ability to employ all these tools came to the fore. In this decisive third clash with Darius III, Alexander turned the tide of battle through military improvisation. During the fighting, the Persians managed to pin the Greek flanks with their cavalry and chariots, partly lured by Alexander himself and his companions on the Hellenic right flank. However, Alexander used his rear guard to charge from the right wing of the center formation and break into the Persian center at the rear of the battlefield. The chariots could not turn in time, being too occupied with the Greek flanks. Eventually, Darius had to flee for fear of being surrounded and captured. Defeated by Alexander's military skill, Darius's forces were not incapable of fighting wars. Far from it. The Achaemenid armies were always a cosmopolitan behemoth, drawing from the finest of the 1,000 nations ruled by the empire. Nevertheless, the aforementioned political turmoil within the rather labyrinthine structures of the Achaemenid court meant that Darius was less able to counter Alexander's advance. For instance, Darius did prepare for the Greek attack, ordering the satraps of Asia Minor to fight off the Hellenes. But there were military issues on multiple fronts in the late 330s BCE, including a revolt in Egypt. So Darius had to both prepare for Alexander's arrival and tame the breadbasket of his empire. Unfortunately for Darius, by the time he managed to bring some stability to Egypt, Alexander had already established a foothold in Asia Minor, following his victory at the Battle of Granicus. The Persian military was also vast in numbers. Yet in the two battles where Darius fought Alexander, Issus and Gaugamela, it proved unable to adapt quickly to the changing tides of battle. Many explanations have been offered for this weakness, from poor leadership by Darius himself, to the choice of battlefield terrain at Issus, to inflexibility in battle tactics. Whatever the case, Alexander's military capabilities were both more robust and more adaptable than those of Darius. Thus, when the two titans clashed, Persian numbers could not overcome the Greek phalanxes. Logistical factors. Alexander's success, at least in the first decisive half of his expedition across Persia's realm, also relied heavily on logistical masterstrokes. In our previous video on Alexander's logistics, we noted that his troops carried a lighter load than previous Greek forces and rarely used carts. This flexibility of movement was important throughout Alexander's campaigns, but in Asia Minor and the Levant, he had an additional logistical boon. Alexander's naval support followed him through Asia Minor and the Levant, including his important battles at Tyre and Gaza. They provided logistical and supply support as the general solidified his control over the western parts of the Persian Empire. Moreover, The populations of Asia Minor included Greeks who were friendly to Alexander and gladly supplied him during his early campaigns in the 330s. Many Levantine and Cypriot cities also submitted and fed Alexander's troops, despite the famous resistance of the Tyrians. And of course, the Egyptians, who controlled the great agricultural wealth of the Nile, eagerly saw Alexander as a liberator from the Persians they had so often revolted against. Alexander's logistics were strained on occasion in Asia Minor, but only became truly unsustainable when he pursued Bessus, the usurper and murderer of Darius, in Bactria, Sogdiana, Gandhara, and Arachosia, where the terrain was far from Persepolis and very harsh. Alexander's army did indeed struggle, only when they found local support, such as when Gandharan kings allied with him, was Alexander spared from complete oblivion. Our sources on Darius III's logistics are almost non-existent, so we must speculate based on the Persian Empire's issues at the time. Darius does appear to have been able to sustain large armies on the march, and to have provisioned his forward operating hubs in Asia Minor, which were manned by local satraps. We must also not forget that his forces were multinational and could draw resources from across the empire. So it was not a question of how many provisions Darius could acquire, but of where and how to use them. The main disadvantage of his logistics may have come from the army's large size. It was likely less flexible than Alexander's forces. Whereas the Greeks could cover long distances with relative ease, the Persians still had to maintain their massive supply and equipment trains, along with a larger number of servile populations to fill support roles like cooking and smithing. In addition, the loss of control over Asia Minor and Egypt cost the Achaemenid forces dearly, because their main supply lines now had to come from much farther inside Persia itself. Thus, the local logistics of the Persians, who were meant to defend against Alexander until Darius could assemble his massive forces, had to rely on often unstable and desertion-prone local collaborators. The major defeats Darius suffered at Issus and Gaugamela likely shattered his logistical network. And when Alexander captured Persepolis, Darius lost most of the legitimacy that had allowed him to muster so many resources. Propaganda factors. Wars of conquest are often won as much by rhetoric as by arms, and here, another convergence of circumstances contributed to Alexander's victory over Darius. The Macedonian youth who entered Asia Minor after subduing rebels in the Balkans carried an ideological mission that he preached wherever he went: the liberation of the Greeks of Asia Minor from the Persian yoke and vengeance for the Persian invasion of Hellas a century and a half earlier. Or at least, that is what he claimed to his Greek audiences. In reality, Alexander was a masterful political propagandist, keenly adapting his message to whomever he was addressing. To the Greeks, he focused on his anti-Persian pedigree and the liberation of the Hellenes of Asia. But when he went to the Levant and Egypt, he acted as both their liberator and a man who wished to engage with local cultures. When he ended up taking Darius's family hostage, he is also said to have treated them with respect. Over time, much to the dismay of many of his companions, he adopted certain local elements in clothing and ruling style. For example, he tried to incorporate Persian customs such as the royal tent and proskynesis, prostrating oneself before the King of Kings, into how he was addressed. As we discussed in our Persianization of Alexander video, the Macedonian general hoped to build an ideology of universal monarchy using both Greek and Persian elements, a propaganda tactic that allowed him to assert control over most of the Persian Empire. His propaganda methods may have alienated some of his companions at times, but they won him support and rapport with local elites throughout the Persian realm. Alexander's political theater enabled him to assert control over the lands he had taken by sword and spear. In Darius's case, little survives of his propaganda efforts to rally the empire to his side. Given that he was a distant relative of the Achaemenids, his claim to the throne was likely weak at first. Yet he managed to remain on the throne for nearly 6 years and amass a large army against Alexander, only losing legitimacy when Alexander decisively defeated him in battle. Nor can we readily accept claims that Darius was weak because of the eunuch Bagos's presence at court. This is because our sources on the matter are Greek and thus heavily biased in favor of Alexander. What appears to have been Darius's main problem in political maneuvering was that the Achaemenid Empire was already strained from internal turmoil. For the Levantine and Egyptian audiences who received Alexander, the propaganda of the King of Kings seemed far less believable after decades of upheaval and revolts. The only remaining audience Darius could rely on, the Persian elites, probably could not reconcile his claim to fame and kingship once Alexander achieved victory at Gaugamela. The recent history of the Achaemenid Empire made Darius's political and rhetorical maneuvering much harder than Alexander's, who was a new power whose ideology was not yet tainted by decades of imperial overreach. Administrative factors. Finally, there were administrative factors that enabled Alexander's victory, namely, his ability to secure the confidence of the elites he ultimately conquered. This was not an innovation of the Greek general himself. In fact, it had been a key ingredient in the recipe for success of the Achaemenid Empire. Alexander's success lay in taking these tactics, along with other Achaemenid administrative institutions, and using them to his advantage. Thus, Alexander was not merely relying on propaganda to conquer the Persians, but was building and adapting networks with local elites. For instance, when he conquered Ionia upon landing in Asia Minor, he restored the democracies of the city-states but ensured they paid vassalage taxes to him. When he took the core of the Persian Empire at Persepolis and Susa, he tried to engage with and maintain many satrapal administrative structures. Alexander often innovated by placing Greeks in positions of authority alongside some Persian satraps, as well as by securing the allegiance of many Achaemenid nobles at court. This is because, according to Rolf Strootman, the Achaemenid Empire's political and administrative core was a vast web of social networks, into which Alexander understood he needed to insert himself. This combination of continuity and innovation was key to Alexander securing control over Persia. Darius III appears not to have had an equal level of control over both imperial and local social networks. His uneven grip on the Achaemenid realm hindered his ability to block Alexander from establishing a springboard in his territory. This allowed the Macedonian to gain additional territories through effective use of logistical supply chains. It was also much easier for social elites in Judea, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor to switch their allegiance to Alexander. Darius, therefore, had only the core of the Persian elite on his side. However, he could not sustain this support once he was defeated in battle by Alexander. This weakness may have stemmed from the sheer magnitude of his defeats, or from his provincial origins, as a distant relative of the royal family. Consequently, Darius fled eastward to the mountains of Bactria and Sogdiana. But his alliance structure was insecure, and the satrap turned pretender Bessus killed him. The convergence of the military and propaganda factors mentioned earlier, along with the instability of the Persian Empire's background, made the administrative foundations of Darius's defense against the Greek invasion rather shaky. Once they came under the slightest pressure, Darius lost his legitimacy in the eyes of his fellow nobles. Alexander's swift capture of those institutions as soon as Darius fled made any counter-attack highly implausible. Conclusion in the end. It was a combination of historical factors that enabled Alexander's conquest of Persia. Alexander's genius was an important part of the equation, but he also faced a formidable opponent in Darius III. Thus, it was both Alexander's ability to easily establish a foothold in Asia Minor and the troubles rocking the Persian Empire that gave him a solid foundation for victory. In addition, Philip's military reforms and Alexander's own strategic capabilities enabled a push into Persia and the Levant. Alexander's diplomatic and administrative skills, along with his use of Achaemenid and Levantine officials, helped cement Greek rule, and the stunning military victories at Gaugamela, Issus, and Granicus ultimately cost Darius his power base. Alexander's victory was not inevitable and was partly due to favorable circumstances. But it was also built on prudent foundations. Alexander's own ability to innovate and the reliability of his companions. More videos on the ancient world are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 2,000 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description, or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos. Learn about our schedule, get early access to our content, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.